As you come in, I'll start to welcome you. I'm Paul North, and these are the Franke Lectures in the Humanities at the Whitney Humanities Center. This is a series called The Value of Marx's Capital, which I'm convening along with my co-conspirator, Paul Reiter at Ohio State, who is the valiant translator of a new translation of Volume 1 into English. The series is also a companion to an undergraduate seminar. So the undergrads have valiantly gone through Volume 1 with a kind of a microscope. And they've survived. And if they have survived, they're in the audience tonight. I have to read this. The Franke Lectures are made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke and are intended to present important topics in the humanities to a wide and general audience. I need to thank, as I always do, Alice Kaplan, the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, Sandra Malan-Bowles, and Leanna Hirschfeld-Crowen, who have done behind the scenes organizing, and Audrey Leek, who is our tech genius, making things stay on track. I know a lot of you have been here, so you've heard this before. We will have the presentation from our speaker. Then tonight we're going to have a short response by our friend and another co-conspirator, Michael Heinrich, who's back to discuss a little bit with Fred Mosley, and then we'll open to questions. Hold your questions and put them into the chat when we get to that period, otherwise I will lose them. I'm doing my best to keep everybody in order. It is a great pleasure to introduce Fred Mosley, who is an emeritus professor of economics at Mount Holyoke College, where he taught Marx and Marxian economic theory for many years. He has published extensively on Marxian theory and the Marxian analysis of the US economy. His latest book is Money and Totality, a macro-monetary interpretation of Marx's logic in Capital, and The End of the Transformation Problem. We can celebrate that. That was from 2016. He also edited and wrote the introduction to the English translation of Marx's economic manuscript of 1864 to 65. These are the manuscripts that are newly translated into English that became Volume 3 of Capital, edited by Engels. He's a longtime member of the Union for Radical Political Economics and served as program director for the URPE sessions at the annual convention of the American Economic Association for 10 years. I'd like to welcome Fred Mosley. Fred, I'm going to give the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this very interesting and innovative, I think, seminar. I've watched some of the other sessions, and it's been really an inspiration to hear the different perspectives on Volume 1. Thanks also to the Whitney Foundation for the generous funding for this seminar. That is really quite a contribution, both the theory and the pedagogy, I think, of Marxian theory. Well, the paper I'm going to present tonight is different from my original intention and the one I sent to Paul in September, just to explain a little bit. That paper was an overview of all of Volume 1 with a focus on these two important aspects that I discussed in my recent book, the monetary nature of Marxist theory in Volume 1 and the macro nature of Volume 1, mainly explaining the total surplus value in the economy as a whole. However, listening to the presentation by my old friend Michael Heinrich, in his presentation in the seminar, I thought I would add a few comments to my paper, and then I kept adding more and more comments. Eventually, I had a whole new paper, obviously very stimulated by Mikhail's opportunity to engage again with Mikhail. And I decided I would discuss this new paper in my presentation. both because that's what I'm most interested in at the moment, and I also hope you will be more interesting to participants to dig deep into the all-important chapter 1 and to consider these two somewhat different interpretations of this important chapter. If some of you may have read the other paper and have questions about that, I would, of course, be happy to discuss. And let me say, even though Mikhail and I disagree about some aspects of interpretation of Marx's theory of value and money in chapter 1, I want to say at the outset how much I appreciate Mikhail's contribution to Marxian scholarship and how much I have learned from him, especially about the mega. I first learned about the mega from Mikhail in the early 90s, from a 1989 paper he published in Capital and Class about the manuscript of 1861-63, published for the first time in the mega in the 80s, and almost unknown at the time among English-speaking Marxists. And I was very excited, including myself. So I was very excited to learn about the mega, and much of my research since then has been related to the mega in one way or another. So for me, and for many other English-speaking and German-challenged Marxists, Mikhail has been a very important kind of conduit from German Marxian scholarship, and especially the mega, to Anglo Marxists, which I appreciate very much. You could say today maybe Mikhail has been a sort of super spreader in the good sense of the term, of German Marxian scholarship. So my talk will focus on chapter 1. And, by all accounts, chapter 1 is a very difficult chapter, and for that reason, a very controversial chapter. Marx said in the preface to the first edition, as you remember, beginnings are always difficult in all sciences. The understanding of the first chapter will therefore present the greatest difficulty. I have popularized, he says, the passages concerning the substance of value and the magnitude of value as much as possible. And the section on the form of value is the most difficult. My favorite preface, actually, to volume 1 is to the French edition. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but he says, the method of analysis which I have employed and which had not previously been applied to economic subjects makes the reading of the first chapter rather arduous, and it is to be feared that the French public, substitute the American public, always impatient to come to a conclusion, eager to know the connection between the general principles and the immediate questions that have aroused their passions, may be disheartened because they cannot move on at once. Marx says, this is a disadvantage I am powerless to overcome unless it be by forewarning and forearming those readers who zealously seek the truth. There's no royal road to science, right? No easy road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. So you probably have found chapter 1 to be a fatiguing climb, and I hope there will also be some luminous summits. So first, I want to briefly describe the overall logical structure of chapter 1 that Marx alluded to in these prefaces. And the key point to understand about the logical structure is that there are 3 main aspects of Marx's concepts of value. Right? It's a complicated concept, right? And these 3 aspects are the substance of value, the magnitude of value, and the form of appearance. Value, and so I will briefly describe each one of these. So first, the substance of value, right? This is the common property of commodities that determines their exchange values with other commodities, which Marx, of course, assumed to be the abstract labor required to produce commodities. So that's the substance of value, the common property that determines the exchange value. Right? Then the magnitude of value is quantitative, right? The quantity of the substance of value required to produce commodities, the quantity of abstract labor required, contained in commodities, which Marx called the socially necessary labor time contained in commodities. Right? So substance, magnitude, then the form of appearance of value, the money and prices, the observable phenomenon. Right? The substance and magnitude of value are not directly observable as such in units of abstract labor. Therefore, commodities require an observable form of appearance so that the magnitude of each commodity can be compared and equated with the magnitudes of value of all other commodities. And this observable form of appearance is ultimately derived as money and money prices. Sections 1 and 2 of chapter 1 are about the substance and magnitude of value. Section 1 is the most important. The title of section 1 is substance of value, the subtitle, substance of value, magnitude of value. Right? And section 3 is about the form of appearance of value. Its title is the value form or exchange value. The point I want to emphasize is that there is a strict causal relation between these three aspects of value. Causal relation is that the substance and the magnitude of value are derived and presupposed in section 1 and 2, and then the form of appearance of value is derived from the substance and magnitude of value in volume 3. So I think it really helps us to understand this overall logical structure, and then the whole chapter, I think, becomes more intelligible and perhaps less of a fatiguing climb. Excuse me, my voice isn't what it used to be. Trying to maintain. Okay, so then one more kind of introduction, just to kind of preview and identify 4 important controversial issues involved in chapter 1, in the interpretation of chapter 1. So the first issue is in section 1, Marx's derivation of abstract labor as the substance of value, as the common property of commodities that determines their exchange values. And the issue is, what's the logic of this derivation, and is the derivation valid, acceptable? Second issue, with respect to the magnitude of value defined in volume 1, is this magnitude of value a property of each single individual commodity? Or is the magnitude of value a property of multiple commodities possessed jointly together? Actually, I learned from an email from Mikhail yesterday that perhaps we don't disagree as much as I previously thought about that. And so I'm happy about that and will not concentrate on that as much. Third issue, and this is really, I think, the most important issue, both between Mikhail and myself and the general Marxian scholarship, is the magnitude of value determined entirely in production, the production process, or does it also depend, at least in part, on circulation and demand for a particular product? And then fourthly, just the derivation in section 3 of money and prices as the necessary form of appearance of value. And for me, the main issue here is that this very important section is often overlooked or not discussed in any depth. And I think it's in large part because of its difficulty, and it seems it's so boring and detailed, but it's very important as we shall see. So I will now review kind of section by section my interpretation of chapter 1 with substantial textual references. And then I will discuss at least one aspect in particular of Mikhail's interpretation. This third issue of is the determination of the magnitude of value in production and/or exchange. Okay. So section 1, the substance of value, abstract labor, the magnitude of value, socially necessary labor time. Section 1 begins with an analysis of a commodity as a general system of commodity exchange. And this general system is assumed to be mutually consistent. You know, A is equal to B, and B is equal to C, and A is equal to C. And this property of mutual consistency implies that commodities are treated objectively as equivalents. Exchange is the exchange of equivalents. Each commodity is in principle equivalent with all other commodities. This relation of equivalence, in turn, implies that each commodity must possess some common property, and possess this common property in definite quantities that determine the ratios in which commodities are equivalents with one another. Marx discussed an example of a relation of equality between two commodities, the famous corn and iron example, which he expressed in terms of an equation. Right, that emphasizes the relation of equality between commodities. Marx says, whatever their relation of exchange may be, it can always be represented by an equation, right? In which a given quantity of corn is equated with some quantity of iron. So what does this equation signify? Marx asks. It signifies that a common element of identical magnitude exists in both of these things, in the two different things. So, and Marx, of course, argued that this common property of commodities that determines their exchange values is abstract labor, the substance of value. Marx summarized his derivation of abstract labor as the substance of value in the following key passage. So let us look at the residue of the products of labor. So we're looking at a commodity here considered within a system of general commodity exchange, right? So what do we see? Well, we don't really see anything, but we now understand that there is nothing left of them but what he calls a phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor. All these things now tell us, as we observe, is that human labor power has been expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values. So Marx described, as we see, the substance of value as a phantom-like objectivity because this abstract labor contained in commodities is not directly observable as such. It exists, it's contained within commodities, but it's not something we can observe. And we will come back to this point in section 3. So Marx's derivation then of abstract labor as the substance of value can consist of the following steps. Each commodity is considered to be an equal, an equivalent to all other commodities. The relation of equality implies that all commodities possess a common property, right? And this common property is abstract labor, right? So that's the bare bones of the derivation in section 1. And in the next paragraph, after this summary, Marx previewed his later derivation of section 3 on money as the necessary form of appearance of this substance of value, abstract labor. And he noted, Marx noted in this preview, we must first consider the nature of value independently of its form of appearance. So first, we're just going to consider the commodity in terms of abstract labor and socially necessary labor time, independently of money and prices. And he says, the progress of our investigation will bring us back to exchange value as the necessary mode of expression, form of appearance of value. For the present, however, we must first consider the nature of value independently of its form of appearance. And also independently of any actual act of exchange, because we're just observing this commodity and its properties. On the next page, then Marx defined the magnitude of value in units of labor time, hours, days, independently of its form of appearance in terms of money. The quantity, the magnitude of value is measured by its duration, labor time, and a particular scale of hours or days. And Marx clarified that the hours of labor time that constitute the magnitude of value are not measured by actual hours of concrete labor, which would be observable, but are instead measured in terms of a social average. Quantities of labor are what he calls socially necessary labor time required to produce commodities. His definition in a sentence, socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. So the magnitude of value is a social average and not any particular individual quantity of labor. And then in the next paragraph, Marx summarized very clearly what exclusively determines the magnitude of the value of any article is therefore the amount of labor socially necessary, the labor time socially necessary for its production. So one other important point in section 1 that I didn't mention in my paper is that socially necessary labor time, Marx says, varies inversely with the productivity of labor, with the quantity of a product produced per hour of abstract labor. And I will come back to this point later as well. So toward the end of section 1, thinking again about this overall logical structure and the 3 aspects of value, toward the end, Marx summarizes the argument thus far in another preview of section 3 on the form of appearance with the following summary of the logical structure of chapter 1. He says, now we know the substance of value, right? It is labor. We know the measure of its magnitude. It is labor time. The form, which stamps value as exchange value, remains to be analyzed. But before this, we need to develop the characteristics we have already found more fully. So we need to develop the substance and magnitude more fully in terms of labor time, in terms of abstract labor and socially necessary labor time, before we go on to the form of appearance of value in section 3. So I think Marx is emphasizing this logical structure, which I think is very important. Okay, just a word about section 2, which further develops the substance and magnitude of value prior to money and prices. He further clarifies that the precise meaning of the magnitude of value as socially necessary labor time in units of hours or days is he clarifies the assumption about different skills and how he treats skilled labor. He states that the basic unit of measure of socially necessary labor time is simple unskilled labor without special development. And that then skilled labor is treated in the following way. 1 hour of skilled labor is assumed to count in the determination of the magnitude of value as some multiple coefficient of 1 hour of simple unskilled labor. Marx put it, more complex labor counts as intensify, or rather multiply simple labor, so that a smaller quantity of complex labor is considered equal to a larger quantity of simple labor, right? And this reduction is assumed to have taken place here in section 2, right? Prior to the derivation of money in the form of appearance in section 3. Then there's section 3. Again, a section that's often overlooked, but is very important because it links the inner hidden essence of value with the observable forms of appearance. It's actually one of my favorite sections. That's so much blood, sweat, and tears that I have come to appreciate its significance. As I mentioned, the logic in section 3 is a continuation of the logic in sections 1 and 2. We have already seen that Marx explicitly noted in section 1 that this logical continuity between the sections. So as previewed in section 1, section 3 derives money as the necessary form of appearance of the substance and magnitude of value in sections 1 and 2. And very briefly summarized, Marx's argument in section 3 is as follows. The necessity of money arises from the fact that the substance and magnitude of value are not directly observable as such in units of labor time, as already mentioned. So this is what Marx meant in section 1 by phantom-like objectivity, it means not observable. Right? Therefore, the question addressed in section 3 is the following. How do the presupposed, unobservable quantities of socially necessary labor time contained in commodities as previously derived, how does socially necessary labor time acquire an objective observable form of appearance so that the value of each commodity can, in fact, in practice, be compared with the value of all other commodities? That's the subject that Marx promised twice in subject 1 to return to, as we have seen. And the progress of Marx's investigation has indeed led back to exchange value as the necessary form of appearance of the substance and magnitude of value. Marx posed his question in section 3 in the introduction to section 3 as follows. He says, not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. It is in this sense the direct opposite of coarsely sensuous objectivities as physical objects. Says we may twist, we're analyzing this commodity, this representative commodity, right? And he says we may twist and turn this commodity as we wish. right? It remains impossible to grasp it. It remains impossible to observe it as a thing possessing value. So then Marx's general answer in section 3 to this important question of how unobservable quantities of abstract labor obtains an observable form of appearance is that the quantity of abstract labor, or socially necessary labor time, in any given commodity is objectively expressed in terms of the physical quantity of another commodity, the equivalent commodity, and ultimately the money commodity. And this equivalent commodity is equal to the given commodity because it contains the same quantity of socially necessary labor time. So by equating these two commodities that have the same quantity of labor time, the magnitude, substance and magnitude of value in the first commodity is expressed in terms of the physical quantity of the equivalent commodity that contains the same quantity of labor time. Marx says, we started from exchange value or the exchange relation of commodities in order to track down the value that lay hidden, unobservable within it. We must now return to this form of appearance of value. So the logic is from the hidden to the observable, from the observable form of appearance is derived from the hidden substance and magnitude of value. And perhaps the clearest evidence that section 3 presumes that each commodity contains a definite quantity of abstract labor, and that these presumed quantities of abstract labor are used to provide a quantitative labor theory of exchange value, is one subsection in particular of the simple form of value that is entitled the quantitative determinacy of the relative form of value. Pages 144 to 146 in the Penguin edition. Very important and often overlooked subsection. In this subsection, Marx emphasized that the abstract labor contained in commodities is presupposed, and it must be expressed not only in qualitative terms as the same kind of homogeneous human labor, but also must be expressed in quantitative terms as a definite quantity of magnitude of value contained in commodities. So socially necessary labor time is a quantity, and therefore its objective form of appearance must also be quantity. So in this subsection, it is clearly and explicitly assumed that any commodity, he says, contains a definite quantity of human labor. That's the presupposition. The equality of linen and coats, Marx says, presupposes the presence of exactly as much of the substance of value or the same quantity of labor time in the two commodities. This subsection also discusses how the quantitative expression of the linen in terms of the exchange value with coats changes. The quantitative expression of the value of the linen in terms of the quantity of coats, this quantitative ratio changes if the labor time in either the quantity, in either the linen or the coat changes. So the presupposed quantities of labor time change, and Marx discusses 4 cases, right? First, the labor time required to produce the linen changes, then the labor time required to produce the coat changes, and then both together, and then in different directions. But in each case, the labor time contained in the commodities is presupposed, and that then determines the exchange ratios. So I have an extensive excerpt from this subsection in my paper. And I will come back to this later as well. But the basic logic, I think, is very clear from the presupposed labor times in production to exchange values in exchange. These conclusions with respect, this is in a subsection of the simple form of value, but the same conclusions apply as well to the expanded form of value, the general form of value, and ultimately the money form of value and money prices. Money prices are determined by relative quantities of labor time in production, and changes in exchange values are determined by changes in these relative quantities of labor time required to produce a given commodity and the equivalent. In subsection C of section 3, the general form of value is defined in terms of equations to emphasize the relation of equality between the relative and the equivalent forms. 1 coat is equal to 20 yards of linen, or 10 pounds of tea is equal to 20 pounds of linen, or 40 pounds of cotton is equal to 20 pounds of linen, etc. Right? So all these equations presuppose that the two commodities on either side of the equation contain the same property and contain an equal magnitude of the same commodity. That's what an equation means. Marx emphasized again in this section that the general form of value is not only qualitative, right? It's not only an expression of abstract labor as a common property, but of that this expression of value is quantitative, right? And expresses says in this general form of value, when all commodities are counted now finally as comparable with the linen, all commodities appear not only as qualitatively equal as value in general, but also as values of quantitatively comparable magnitudes. So section D subsection D of section 3 is entitled the money form of value. And in this subsection, the price of a commodity is defined as the exchange value of a given commodity with the money commodity. And this price is determined, as before, by the relative quantities of labor time presupposed to be contained in the given commodity and the money commodity. So the price of a commodity in terms of gold is the quantity of gold, right? A physical quantity, a quantity of gold that contains the same amount of labor time as the given commodity whose price is being determined. And there's another set of equations similar to the equations for the general form of value, except that the equivalent commodity is gold rather than linen. So there's a gold price for each and every other commodity, which of course presumes that gold and each of the other commodities contain the same quantity of socially necessary labor time. Then in the first edition of volume 1, unfortunately not in late, Marx concluded his derivation of money and prices as the necessary form of appearance of value by emphasizing once again the overall logical structure here. And that the form of value, what he says, arises out of or is derived from the substance and the magnitude of value. But Marx says what was decisively important was to discover the inner necessary connection between value form, value substance, and value amount, right? And expressed conceptually, he says, to prove that the value form arises out of the value concept, right? So I think these many passages in chapter 1 provide very strong, unambiguous textual evidence to support the interpretation that chapter 1 presupposes that individual commodities contain definite quantities of socially necessary labor time as derived in sections 1 and 2. And then section 3 derives money prices as the necessary form of appearance of these quantities, presupposed quantities of abstract labor. That's the inner necessary connection between sections 1 and 2 and 3 of chapter 1, and that's the overall logical structure of Marx's labor theory of value and money and abstract prices in chapter 1. Okay, how am I doing in time?
You're doing great.
Okay, so then I'll take the time I have left to discuss this most important aspect, or at least difference of interpretation between Mikhail and myself. And I will suggest a possibility perhaps for some maybe less of a disagreement. We shall see. And that issue has to do with the determination of the magnitude of value, right? Is the magnitude of value socially necessary labor time? Is that determined entirely in production, or also at least in part in exchange, and depends on the demand on the market for individual commodities? So this is really one of the most controversial issues among Marxian economists in general in recent decades. Mikhail's interpretation, as I understand it, comes out of the new Marx reading in Germany, which has evolved in the rest of the world in terms of value form. The so-called value form interpretation of Marxist theory. And this so-called value form interpretation has become popular in recent decades, and its proponents argue that socially necessary labor time is not determined solely by average labor time in production, but also depends in part on social demand on the market. And Mikhail is a prominent proponent of this value form interpretation. Mikhail wrote in his introduction to Capital book, labor time expended in production as well as for the satisfaction of monetary social demand constitutes value. So turning the sentence around, the value is constituted both by the labor expended in production and the satisfaction of monetary demand. So first, I want to review again some of the main passages in chapter 1 that support my interpretation that socially necessary labor time is determined by production.
Hey, Fred, could I interrupt you for a sec?
Yeah.
I just want to ask a question that might open up this disagreement or almost agreement to everyone who's joining us. What would you say the stakes are of your interpretation, his interpretation, and the disagreement? What's at stake there, really, aside from the proofs one way or the other?
Well, I think, first of all, just being what I'm trying to be as, true as possible to Marx's text. And that in itself is a first objective. Mm-hmm. I also think it, eventually the differences have to do with whether Marxist theory is a theory of, at least in part, of equilibrium prices, right? Or non-equilibrium prices, and what's the relative importance? And that's also been a kind of separate discussion going on in Marxian scholarship for a long time, right? But what I think is not very clearly and widely recognized, and including by myself, until really working on this paper, right, is the connection between those two issues. So is Marxist theory about kind of, I would say Marxist theory is mainly about surplus value, right? but then equilibrium prices are assumed and explained in order ultimately not to explain equilibrium prices, but to explain surplus value.
And how does it change our understanding of surplus value to think that value is created and gets its magnitude in the production process with no additional inputs?
Okay, the Marxist theory of surplus value, the inner law, as he called it, surplus value is determined by surplus labor. Right? Surplus labor in production and a clear, strong conclusion of exploitation. Right? But if surplus value also depends on the market, right, on demand, that is what Marx called a distracting influence, right, and is a less strong theory of the inner law of surplus value and exploit. It brings in distractions, right?
Right, that's very helpful. I appreciate it. I know that line of thinking to some degree, that if value is all created in production, then it strengthens the revolutionary position of the proletariat, or makes exploitation a graver issue or a more emphatic problem in capital. So I appreciate your clarifying that. I didn't
Okay, and we can come back, I'm sure.
derail your presentation, so you're welcome to go on with it.
Okay, thank you. So let me just review a few of the key quotations. So we'll have my interpretation. As we saw, Marx defined socially necessary labor time as the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production, normal for a given society, and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. The next paragraph, Marx summarized what exclusively determines the magnitude of value of any article is therefore the labor time socially necessary for its production. Right? So nothing is said here about exchange and demand. What exclusively determines socially necessary labor time is the average labor time in production. And coming back to the issue of the inverse relationship between the magnitude of value and the productivity of labor, toward the end of section 1, Marx discussed this relationship, and he said, the value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the value would remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. Right? So even though supply and demand may be changing around all over the place, right? If the quantity required for its production is constant, the value is constant, right? But the latter changes, the productivity changes with value changes with every variation in the productivity of labor. And he says, the productivity of labor is determined by various circumstances: the average amount of skill of the workman, the state of science, the degree of its practical application, the social organization of production, the extent and capabilities of the means of production, by physical conditions, etc. Right? So these are characteristics of production that affect socially necessary labor time. And in general, the greater the productivity of labor, the less is the labor time required to produce that article, and the less, therefore, is the value. And vice versa, he says, the value of a commodity, therefore, varies inversely with the productivity of the labor incorporated in it. Well, I also wanted to quote from that subsection on the quantitative determination of the form of value. But I must have misplaced that page, but it's, again, I hope you will look at it, right? Page 144, 5 and 6. This is the labor times are presupposed, and that then determines the relative form of that.
Do you feel like there's enough evidence on the table to rest your case temporarily?
Yes. I also wanted to discuss the value form. Sorry, I lost my page there. Okay, so the value form interpretation, in contrast, right, argues that if supply is greater than demand in an industry, then the price of the commodity will fall, and the socially necessary labor time will also be reduced, right, because of the insufficient social demand, even if the average labor time in production remains the same. However, and this is the point we touched on a minute ago, I argue that Marxist theory in Capital generally assumes that supply is equal to demand, right? And so assumes away that case, except for a few asides here and there. In other words, Marxist theory of value in Capital is not about the daily fluctuation of market prices, but is instead about the center of gravity of those market prices, the equilibrium prices, the long run average, which are the centers of gravity around which market prices fluctuate. The main question, as I said, in Marxist theory is to explain surplus value, and the inner law of surplus value is surplus labor, and to consider fluctuations due to supply and demand, Marx argued at the end of chapter 5, would be a distraction from discovering and pinpointing the inner law of surplus value. So I present more textual evidence in my paper to support this supply is equal to demand equilibrium interpretation of Marxist theory of value, and would be happy to discuss these later. And I think the evidence is conclusive that Marx is trying to explain the inner laws of capitalism and not the daily fluctuations of market prices. And since equilibrium prices assume supply is equal to demand, then in that case, supply and demand have no effect on the determination of equilibrium prices. They cancel each other out. Equilibrium prices are determined in that case solely by the fundamental cause of average labor times in production. Supply and demand determine market prices, not equilibrium prices. And furthermore, if supply is not equal to demand in an industry, which is usually the case, the market price of the commodity will be different from the equilibrium price. But the equilibrium price will nonetheless remain the same, right? And will still be determined by the average labor time in production, even though supply and demand are not equal and market prices are fluctuating around the equilibrium price. Equilibrium price will change only if the average labor time in production changes. One more page. Mikhail wrote in his book that socially necessary labor time is determined by 3 reductions. And this was actually very helpful to me. One, reduction of unequal productivities of labor to average productivity within each industry. 2, the reduction of skilled labor to unskilled labor in all industries. And 3, the reduction of supply to demand. Right? So, however, if it is assumed that supply is equal to demand, then Mikhail's reduction number 3 of supply to demand is nullified, plays no role, right? And in this case, socially necessary labor time is determined by the first two reductions, unequal productivities to average productivity, skilled labor to unskilled labor, right? And these two remaining reductions are characteristics of production and determinants of labor time in production. Thus, if it is assumed that supply is equal to demand, as Marx generally assumed in Capital, then demand and exchange have no effect on the determination of socially necessary labor time, even with Machel's interpretation of socially necessary labor time, because the supply is assumed to be equal to demand, and that reduction is not necessary. So I hope Michael will agree that under the assumption of supply is equal to demand, at least supply socially necessary labor time depends only on the average labor time in production. And if supply is not equal to demand, then we have, I think, two different interpretations of socially necessary labor time, which may, in fact, be compatible, be mutually compatible and not mutually exclusive. They apply to different cases, right? One, an equilibrium concept of socially necessary labor time, determined by average labor time in production and independent of demand, because you're assuming that away, right? And secondly, a disequilibrium concept of socially necessary labor time received through exchange, right? Which also depends on, in part, on demand. And it has occurred to me in recent weeks while working on this paper that maybe we agree on this point more than I thought, right? In the case of supply is equal to demand, I hope we can agree that socially necessary labor time is the average labor time in production, which determines the equilibrium price, right? If so, then the disagreement would really boil down to, in the case of supply not equal to demand, what's the definition of socially necessary labor time, and is the concept operative at all? And it seems to me that maybe these two definitions, I don't think Marx ever talked about this explicitly in terms of socially necessary labor time anyway, but I want to search some more and think some more about this, that the equilibrium and the disequilibrium concepts of socially necessary labor time may be mutually compatible. And I think this would be a significant agreement. And as I said, Michael's discussion of the three reductions, one of which is the reduction of supply demand, I think helped me realize at least this possibility of more of agreement. If supply is equal to demand, then there are only two reductions, both of which have to do with the labor time in production. So I'll stop here for now and give Michael a chance to respond and see what other people have to say. And thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Fred. Let's just take a minute to thank Fred for his talk before we get into the beautiful family fight. There's no better fights than family fights, and especially when they're about scripture. It turns out all sorts of hermeneutic questions are on the table now too. So I think this
sort of what questions?
Hermeneutic questions.
Okay, yeah.
But thank you very much for your presentation. I think, Michael, you'd like to respond, and you could take as much time as you want to do that.
This is dangerous when you allow me this to take as much time as I want. I try to make it briefly. But first, is the connection okay? Can you understand me? Okay. So first, I have to thank Fred that he changed his original idea of a paper and make such big efforts to discuss my approach to value theory. I think this is a very big appreciation of my work, and I'm very thankful for that. That you have main critical points is not bad, because I think in this point we will agree that critique is the method to get progress. Nothing is final, nothing is perfect, so we need critique, and I appreciate your critique on my points. And already in this short exchange we had the last days, I learned a lot, and maybe we will not come to an agreement, but at least also for me it became clearer in which points I have to argue more precise, more exact. And this I learned by you. So I want to focus on the main point we disagree is the magnitude of value already determined by production before the exchange process, or is the magnitude of value not determined by production alone, and insofar also not before the exchange process. Already one person asked before, what is on stake? What are the consequences of these different interpretations? And I think he, not Fred, the person who asked, came to the conclusion, okay, it strengthens revolutionary when everything is rested in production. I think this is rather independent from any revolutionary activities or from insights which lead to revolution. But there is something on stake. When everything already is determined by production, then at least in principle, we can know everything. We can know all the magnitude of value. We can treat value not as an outcome which emerges, like Marx says, in the back of the producers, but we can treat them as known amounts. And exactly this in Soviet Union, in the so-called real socialism planning economy, was attempted. There was the theory of, they called it the conscious application of the law of value. And this conscious application exactly presupposed that we know already by production, without a process of exchange, what are the magnitudes of value. And this planning process was an enormous failure. So for this, the wrong theory they had, and of course, not only this was wrong, I don't want to reduce all the failure of Soviet Union to this single point, but this point also contributed to this. It had some revival some years ago in the discussions of a socialism of the 21st century, when, for example, authors like Paul Cockshott argued by the use of computer, now we have the technology to make use of all this knowledge, and we can use this knowledge we have from the production process of commodity production for a socialist system. I think this is totally wrong, and when you try to do a socialist system according to such assumptions, it will be disastrous. So indeed, there is something on stake. It's not only a question of details or pure science. It has political consequences.
Mikhail, can I ask you just on this point?
Yeah.
It seemed to me that Fred was saying that as a manifestation of value, exchange value allows you to know what's determined in production. Do you mean that when you say you can't treat them as known amounts, the magnitudes of value, do you mean that they're actually being determined in exchange, or they're just coming to be known in exchange? I think there's a difference between being determined and being known. That's
exactly
important.
It is a difference, and they not come in to be known before exchange. They are not determined. They are, as Fred quoted me correctly, they are determined by production and circulation, or production and exchange. Production alone is not enough to determine magnitude of value. And it is not a question of knowledge. I will explain this at once. Let me just do before one remark about different levels of discussion. We can discuss this question where magnitude of value is determined on a hermeneutical level, interpreting Marx texts, what is the opinion of Marx, but also we have to discuss what is the reality of commodity production and commodity exchange. And insofar, the hermeneutical level is only a helper when we assume that Marx did a very good analysis. So we must be clear about his analysis, but the point which is decisive is our analysis then of reality and not the analysis of texts of Marx. So I think we have to distinguish these two levels. I will come briefly to the level of reality. As I take this as an abbreviation. Why do I think that magnitude of value is not determined only by production? Let us restrict to these two determinations. We agree: socially necessary labor time and the reduction of complex labor to simple labor. Socially necessary labor time is a kind of average. There are different kinds of production processes, as Marx discusses this in chapter 1. The one producer is quicker, the other is slower. But what contributes to this average is not just what every producer is doing. It contributes only that products which are brought to the market. When there is a super modern factory with an extremely high productivity, but the products are hindered to enter the market, or the owner of the factory decides to sell these products abroad because he can receive higher prices or whatever, then this factory or the labor in this factory will not contribute to this average socially necessary labor time. So by looking only on the production side, we don't know really what contributes to the to this average. And even more clear it becomes when we look to the reduction of complex labor to simple labor. It is not only one reduction. You have a lot of different kinds of complex labor. All of them must be reduced to simple labor. Let us say 1 hour of labor of a craftsman is reduced to 3 hours of simple labor. 5 hours labor of 1 hour labor of an engineer is reduced to 5 hours of simple labor. But where does this reduction come from? Is it determined by production? I don't know, not even a theory who explains this reduction by production itself. Marx speaks of a social process in the second subsection of chapter 1. And in chapter 7, in the last footnote of this chapter, he stresses that this reduction also depends of social prejudice, for example, that it comes out in a historical process. And we have very striking examples that, for example, such branches of work where women dominate as workers, usually such branches count less in this reduction. It is not a question of the pure complexity of labor or of the production process. It is also a part of social evaluation, and this is beyond the production process. Insofar, I think it is impossible to determine the magnitude of value only by production. I don't want to go deep in the question of demand and supply, which has, I think, nothing to do with the 2 points I just mentioned. But I want to stress one point. It is true that Marx later in Capital says, I presuppose demand and supply equals. And by this, he can abstract from a lot of problems. But what is the demand and the supply which equals? How is demand and supply determined? This we must discuss before we can assume supply and demand equals. And I think what Marx is doing in the 3rd chapter is he gives a second meaning to socially necessary labor time. And this second meaning then defines what is demand. And only then we can discuss, or we can presuppose demand and supply is, we assume that it is equal. But okay, this is another point. Now, I want shortly to come to the hermeneutical level. What is Marx telling us? I think indeed we have to look to the logic of Marx's argumentation, as Fred also stressed. I would say we have to be clear what in the first 3 chapters Marx is doing. What is the object, what Marx wants to research in the first 3 chapters of volume 1? I think it is commodity circulation. This complicated process of commodity circulation, commodity against money, money against commodity, commodity against money, and so on, this permanent intersection is reduced by Marx in a first step of abstraction to the exchange process. Commodity owners exchange commodities, and the core of the analysis of this exchange process is the exchange relation, which Marx analyzes in chapter 1. So when we read Capital, we do the journey backwards. We start with the most abstract core, the exchange relation of 2 commodities. In chapter 2, we include the commodity owners. We come to the production, to the exchange process. And in chapter 3, we see the intersection and interference of all the exchange processes in the circulation, in the commodity circulation. So exchange, sorry, my voice is not in a good condition in the moment. So what Marx analyzes as exchange relation is the most abstract core of the circulation process of commodities. And this exchange relation he dissects like an anatomist. Fred gave the nice quote where Marx says, we have to consider value independently from, I think it's form of appearance or value form. I stress that Marx wrote, we have to consider. He doesn't say value exists independently from value form. He says we have to consider it. And so I think Marx behaves like an anatomist who wants to analyze the human body. And he has to start with certain organs. So maybe he starts with the heart, which is pumping blood, and then comes to the lung, which is filling the blood with oxygen. But this sequence of explanation is not identical with a sequence of existence, that first the heart exists, and then after a while the lung exists, and then after a while something else exists. So what I think is a mistake of Fred is to identify the sequence of explanation we find in Marx with a sequence of existence, a sequence in time. And also, I think it's a mistake to see in this sequence of time a causal relationship, a causality from the what he thinks is first to that what he thinks comes later. At the beginning of his paper, he gives this nice quote from the first edition that Marx said, I wanted to prove that the value form arises from the value concept. This is a very Hegelian wording, and Marx himself said sometimes he is coquetting with Hegelian terminology. Here also becomes clear that this terminology arises from is not a temporal sequence. When you read Hegel's Science of Logic, you have the essence and the necessity that the essence needs a form of appearance. But of course, Hegel nowhere argues that essence exists first in time, and then after a while, it receives a form of appearance. And I think the same is true for value and value form as form of appearance. They can only exist simultaneously. So what Marx is doing in the first chapter, he is dissecting the exchange relation. He talks about value, but value inside the exchange relation, not outside the exchange relation. So this is one important difference in the hermeneutics, in the interpretation. I will just briefly mention another difference. Now, Fred didn't mention it in his lecture, but he mentioned it in the paper he sent me, and I suppose also it was distributed to the audience, where the point is what means the common in the phrase that labor is the common social substance of value. Fred absolutely correctly quotes my interpretation that there are two different ways to interpret this common. Common can mean that two things independently from each other possess a property, or it can mean that common means they share this property. And my interpretation is the second one, they share it. And here is the point I also want to give some textual evidence for my approach, or for the approach that also Marx had in mind, this meaning of common as a shared property inside the exchange relation. There is a difference between the wording of the first edition and the wording of the second edition, which is totally lost in the existing English translations. When you read the first translation, translation of the first edition of Capital, which also Fred quotes, you can read in the translation of Drugstedt, the common social substance which merely manifests itself differently in different use values is labor. In the second edition, you can read a very similar sentence in the translation of Ben Fowkes, as crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values. In both English sentences, we have the word common, but in German, Marx changed the words. In the first edition, the word he used was gemeinsam, and for gemeinsam, common is a proper translation. In the second edition, Marx used the word gemeinschaftlich, and here common is a very poor translation. Gemeinschaftlich comes from the noun Gemeinschaft, community. Gemeinschaftlich, you have something when the community has it. So that Marx changed from gemeinsam, common, to gemeinschaftlich, in community, for me is a very clear sign that he saw the value substance as something which is only existing when there is a relation between the two commodities, and this relation is in the exchange relation. In the exchange relation, we can say the one commodity has a magnitude of value and the other commodity has a magnitude of value. With this, I agree with Fred, but outside this relation, you cannot speak about magnitudes of value. So with this, I want also to close my, my answer to Fred. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. We appreciate your coming back and your being such a good sport and giving us a lot to think about. It's great when we have family fights. It's great when hermeneutic questions get opened up. It's always interesting to me when people use the hagiographical move, which is, this is what Marx was saying. And when people use the move, well, even if he was saying that, he might not be right. These ways of looking at the text are different, and they're both important, and they move around in different people's readings. Fred, I'm going to give the microphone over to you. Do you want to respond?
A few responses. I also want to hear from other people. I will be brief. I want to start with the first point about the magnitude of value cannot be known in production. And I'm not arguing that the magnitude of value socially necessary labor time, it can be known in production. I argue that, Marx assumes that it exists in production in a system of commodity production. We're not, so it's produced for exchange, right? So it's already in production, it's in an exchange relationship. It's in an economy based on commodity exchange, right? So I'm certainly not saying that it is known or has to be known, right? I mean, it exists. And my point is that I stress that Section 3 is about, it's not knowable in production. It's not knowable in terms of abstract labor. That's why money is necessary, right? So I think that kind of misses my point altogether. That socially necessary labor time, in order to is exist but is unknown, right? Is assumed to exist, right? And in order to become known, right, it has to express its hidden value in the observable form of money. So I think you are conflating know and exist, right? And I'm not conflating that. I'm emphasizing that that's not the case. That a value is not known until exchange, until the form of appearance, right? Is the form of appearance, I think the reference to the USSR is not relevant. Because I'm not, this is a theory of capitalism, right? And it was attempted to be applied in crude ways to a planned economy, but I don't think that has anything to do with the validity or lack thereof of Marxist theory, certainly not of my interpretation. And on the simultaneity of everything in capitalism, I think the body analogy is not a good one, because Marx is analyzing capitalism within which is a process, right? And the process is the circuit of capital, right? And the circuit of capital goes through distinct phases, right? Capital exists first on the market in the form of money used to purchase means of production and labor power. Then capital exists in production, right? Where Marx says exclusively capital is formed, right? Surplus value is produced, right? And then, right, consecutively in time, there is the return to the market and the sale of the markets of the products produced and the realization of the value produced, right? So, and I'm not saying that value is known in production, right? I'm saying value is produced in production, and and then subsequently. I mean, I'm not saying that it's that simultaneous determination is not possible in other cases. I'm saying that exchange value, right, is determined by production. Now, in that sequence, production comes before sale, right? And so, in that particular case, in that particular reality, there is temporal sequence of causation. Because we're talking about a process, a circuit. So I think I'll stop there for now and maybe come back, but I'd like to hear from other people too.
Great. So why don't we open up the chat for questions, and maybe we can come back around to these distinctions through other people's minds. There might have been some comments earlier on, but if you want to make a comment, would you put it back in now, repost, and also post your questions? Okay, could we go to Manuel Cacique Herrera? Audrey, would you open Manuel's mic? Manuel, if you're there, you could ask your question. Do we have you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I didn't expect having to speak in English in front of a whole audience. So I'm gonna try really hard to do my best. My question is is obvious that market prices have oscillations. Uh, and with those oscillations, if abstract private labor is the substance of all the value produced, then all the surplus value is the same, remain the same. So when market prices oscillate, capitalists can compete each other to appropriate surplus value produced by other capitalists, because the surplus value pool remains always the same despite the prices oscillations. What would you think of that?
Thank you, Manuel. It was a perfect English rendition of your question. Fred, do you want to respond?
Capitalists would, I mean, that was the subject of volume 3. That is the subject of volume 3, the distribution of surplus value, right? And some capitalists are able to appropriate more surplus value than others for various market power reasons, right? But that is a subsequent division of the surplus value that is produced by workers. So it's a part of the theory. You know, it can be incorporated in theory, but it's because one capitalist appropriates more surplus value than another capitalist doesn't mean the capitalist produced that surplus value. The total surplus value comes from the surplus labor of workers, and then that's divided up in various competitive ways. I hope that helps.
Okay, we have a question from Bilal. Can we open Bilal's mic? Bilal, an intrepid undergraduate in the seminar. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mosley, for your interesting comments. I had a question about inflation in particular. You mentioned how Marxist theory explains the inner laws of capitalism and not minor fluctuations. But one of the inner laws is the sustained increase in general price level that we've seen, constant increase in inflation. So I was wondering whether your interpretation of Marx, maybe just Marx's writings itself, sort of tie in and can explain this inner law of capitalism, or is it something that, I don't know, a lot of Marxist theory that I've seen just somehow overlooks inflation. I'm not really sure how Marx explains a lot of it.
Well, that's a good kind of contemporary question, obviously. And, in Marx's theory, in Capital, he assumes that money is a commodity, right? Some people argue money has to be a commodity, and but I don't think that's true, right? But Marx's theory has to be, I think, updated and elaborated to take into account the fact that money is no longer a commodity like gold, right? So I think that's an important current task of Marxian economics is to develop a more complete theory of non-commodity money. I've done some work on that, and I don't think it's the final answer, but based on some hints Marx gave, when there was inconvertible fiat money in the late 18th and early 20th century, then if too much money is forced into circulation, then prices will rise, right? So that, I think, is at least a starting point. It's not the total answer, and it requires much more development, but also a change of the basic function of definition of what money is in capitalism today.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read a question from the chat from Ann-Lee Summers. Is the disagreement in forming the surplus value problem actually related to appearance about the nature of physical labor versus cognitive labor in the formation of a commodity's socially necessary labor time and hence its labor power? Does value form analysis solve that problem? Also, doesn't this also resemble the later historical issue of monopoly capital unaddressed by Marx but taken on by Baron and Sweezy? Doesn't this also allow for the kinds of issues brought up by analytic Marxism in terms of inequality of distribution, referring to Romer? So the first question is about the difference between physical and cognitive labor in, I guess, the calculation of the magnitude or the creation of the commodity's value. And the second is about
Monopoly capital.
Monopoly capital.
Well, I think the question about monopoly capital is, in my view, much easier to answer. And again, I think that was related to the previous question that monopoly affects the distribution of surplus. Okay, in my view, interpretation of Marx's theory, monopolies affect the distribution of surplus value, but unless that's affecting wages in some way, does not affect the production of surplus value and the total amount of surplus value that's produced, right? So this I would disagree with Moran and Sweezy, right? They thought monopoly capital actually increased surplus value, right? But I think a more consistent interpretation would be that monopolies get a bigger share of the total surplus value, but in general, except maybe on a small scale, do not affect the production and the total amount.
Over time as well, monopolies have to cede their monopoly at a certain point, right? It's a temporally bounded problem, monopoly.
Yeah, it's one aspect of the competition, and competition has to do determines the distribution of surplus value, and that will certainly change over time. The cognitive question, I think, is another challenge. I think that's I think it obviously is value producing. And so, I mean, this would be one example of skilled labor. And so the cognitive labor would produce in an hour more value. How much more value? We don't know. But that is what Marx's theory would suggest. But and then then the question is how important is it to know these reduction coefficients? And I think it is some importance, but I mean, Marx said at the end of chapter 7, his theory of surplus value, this, even though he didn't present any theory of what determines those reduction coefficients, so to speak, he said the same theory applies to skilled labor, right? That skilled labor is paid more, right? But they're also produce value at a higher rate. And therefore the basic theory of surplus value still applies. And I think that would also apply to cognitive labor.
Okay. I want to invite anyone else in the listenership, watchers, viewership to pose some questions. While you're doing that, I want to go back to something that Mikhail brought up that it needs a lot more exposition, and I know maybe he's done it elsewhere, but I want to ask you, Fred, about his proposition that in fact, exchange enters into the constitution of socially necessary labor time. That is, products that are produced and not realized in exchange don't get counted in the average. So this is a backdoor way in that doesn't have anything to do with the supply-demand problem. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the theory assumes a system in which what is produced is exchange. We're looking at a totality with, if in that case, the company that sells elsewhere, right, in another market would not be included in the determination of socially necessary labor time. It's not a purely physical thing that in any country, you do a weighted average of the labor times and determine socially necessary labor time. It's goods that were produced for this market. Right? And that they're the only ones that go into the average. I don't see a problem there.
It looks like there aren't any other questions. We want to thank you for your presentation. Invite you to not sign off while we let everyone else go. Let them thank you for coming and presenting really important material. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you also. It was nice to meet Fred again.
Thanks for your comments as always, and we will be in touch, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mikhail.